The dust hadn't even settled on Marcus Thornfield's grave when I caught his wife Evangeline staring at me across the cemetery with those same hungry eyes that had haunted my dreams for 3 years. My brother was dead, killed by a rattlesnake bite that could have been prevented if he'd listened to reason instead of his pride. Now here I was, standing at his funeral, trying not to think about the woman who'd married the wrong Thornfield brother, and how everything was about to change in ways that would destroy what was left of our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Triple T Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of Texas hill country, with rolling pastures that stretched to the horizon and cattle that grazed under endless blue skies. It had been in the Thornfield family for 4 generations, passed down from father to son like a sacred trust. My grandfather built the main house with his own hands, using timber from the oak grove that still shaded the front porch. The barn could hold 200 head of cattle during harsh winters, and the bunkhouse housed 15 ranch hands who worked the land like it was their own. I was born 10 minutes after my twin brother Marcus, which meant he inherited everything and I inherited nothing but a job working for him. 10 minutes. That's all that separated me from being master of the Triple T instead of just another hired hand who happened to share the owner's last name. But Marcus never let me forget those 10 minutes, and he never let me forget my place. My name is Clayton Thornfield, and this is the story of how love and death tore apart everything our family had built over a century. Marcus and I looked identical from a distance. Same height, same build, same sandy brown hair that curled at the collar. The same green eyes that our mother always said could charm a rattlesnake out of striking. But up close the differences showed. Marcus carried himself like he owned the world, which he did. His smile came easy and confident, while mine had always been more cautious. He was the golden boy who could do no wrong in our father's eyes, while I was the spare who needed to prove his worth every single day. When our father died of consumption 5 years ago, Marcus inherited the ranch without question. I became his foreman, managing day-to-day operations, while he handled the business side from his office in town. It was a good arrangement that kept us both busy and out of each other's hair most of the time. We weren't close like some twins are, but we weren't enemies either. We were just brothers trying to make the best of circumstances neither of us had chosen. That changed 3 years ago when Marcus brought home a wife. Her name was Evangeline Meadows, and she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever laid eyes on. Auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight, skin like porcelain, and blue eyes the color of deep water. She'd been teaching school in Austin when Marcus met her at a cattle auction. He courted her for 2 months with letters and visits before proposing with our grandmother's diamond ring. The wedding was held in the church our great-grandfather had helped build, with half the county in attendance. Evangeline wore white silk that must have cost more than most families made in a year, and Marcus wore his father's best suit with a smile that lit up the entire sanctuary. I stood as his best man, handed him the ring, and watched the woman I was already falling in love with promise herself to my brother forever. Nobody knew how I felt. Nobody could know. It would have destroyed everything, but keeping that secret nearly destroyed me instead. Living on the same ranch as Marcus and Evangeline became torture. I'd watch from the barn as they walked hand in hand through the garden she'd planted behind the house. I'd hear her laugh echoing across the yard, when Marcus would sweep her off her feet and spin her around like they were still courting. At dinner, when the 3 of us ate together in the big dining room, I'd catch myself staring at the way candlelight played across her face, memorizing every detail while trying to make conversation about cattle prices and weather patterns. She was kind to me in the way a sister-in-law should be. She'd ask about my day when I came in dusty and tired from working the range. She'd pour my coffee without being asked and make sure there was always extra cornbread when she knew I was particularly fond of it. Sometimes she'd sit on the porch in the evenings while I played guitar, humming along to songs she recognized. Those were dangerous moments. Sitting there in the gathering dusk, with Evangeline humming softly while fireflies danced in the garden, I could almost pretend we were the married couple, and Marcus was just visiting. I could almost imagine what it would be like to reach over and take her hand, to see those blue eyes look at me with something more than familial affection. But then Marcus would come home from town, and reality would crash back down like a bucket of ice water. He'd kiss her hello right in front of me, his hands possessive on her waist, and I'd have to excuse myself before I did something we'd all regret. The worst part was knowing that she wasn't entirely happy. Oh, she loved Marcus in her own way, I could see that. But there were moments when I'd catch her staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes, like she was wondering about roads not taken. There were times when Marcus would dismiss something she said or make decisions without consulting her, and I'd see her jaw tighten with suppressed frustration. Marcus wasn't cruel, but he was thoughtless in the way that men who've always gotten everything they wanted often are. He assumed Evangeline was content to be his pretty wife who kept house and looked good on his arm at social functions. He never asked what she wanted or what she dreamed about beyond their comfortable life on the Triple T. I knew what she wanted because I paid attention in ways Marcus didn't. She wanted to travel beyond Texas, to see the ocean she'd read about in books. She wanted to learn photography and maybe write stories for magazines back east. She had opinions about politics and literature that Marcus would wave away with a patronizing smile. But I'd listen to her talk for hours about women's suffrage, or the latest novel she'd ordered from Austin. Those conversations usually happened when Marcus was away on business trips to Fort Worth or San Antonio. He'd be gone for days at a time, negotiating cattle sales or meeting with investors, leaving Evangeline alone in the big house with only the cook and housemaid for company. She'd wander down to the barn where I was working and find excuses to talk. About the ranch, about her plans for expanding the garden, about anything that kept us in each other's company. I should have discouraged those visits. I should have been too busy to talk or found reasons to be elsewhere when she came looking for a conversation. Instead, I treasured every moment, every shared laugh, every time she'd touch my arm while making a point about something she'd read in the newspaper. The closest we ever came to crossing the line was during a thunderstorm last spring. Marcus had been gone for a week, and Evangeline had been restless all day, pacing the house like a caged animal. When the storm hit that evening, she came to the barn where I was checking on the horses. Lightning was splitting the sky and thunder shook the building with each crash. "I hate storms," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They make me feel so small and helpless." I wanted to tell her she wasn't helpless, that she was the strongest woman I knew, despite being trapped in circumstances that stifled her spirit. Instead, I offered her a seat on a hay bale and went back to calming the horses. But when a particularly loud thunderclap made her gasp and cover her ears, I found myself sitting beside her, my arm around her shoulders, without conscious thought. She leaned into me, her head against my chest, and for several heartbeats we stayed that way, while rain hammered the roof and wind howled through the gaps in the siding. "Clayton," she whispered, and when I looked down, her face was turned up to mine, lips parted, eyes dark with something that had nothing to do with fear of the storm. I almost kissed her. God help me, I wanted to more than I'd ever wanted anything in my life. But the sound of Marcus's name on her lips when she was married, the weight of the wedding ring on her finger, the knowledge of what it would mean for all of us if I gave in to that temptation, stopped me cold. I pulled away like she was on fire, made some excuse about needing to check the livestock, and spent the rest of the storm riding through the rain rather than staying in that barn with her another minute. We never spoke of what almost happened, but something changed between us after that night. The conversations became more careful, more formal. She stopped coming to the barn as often, and when we were together at meals, there was a tension that Marcus was too preoccupied to notice, but that ate at me like acid. I considered leaving, packing up my gear and heading west to California or north to Montana, anywhere I could start fresh, without the constant reminder of what I couldn't have. But the Triple T was my home, the only life I'd ever known, and I couldn't bring myself to abandon it even for my own peace of mind. So I stayed and tried to content myself with stolen glances and brief conversations, telling myself that having her in my life in some capacity was better than not having her at all. I threw myself into ranch work, spending longer hours on the range, taking on extra responsibilities that kept me away from the house and the temptation she represented. It might have gone on that way indefinitely, all of us trapped in our careful dance of propriety and suppressed desire. If not for what happened 3 months ago, Marcus had been having trouble with rustlers hitting the north pasture, stealing cattle under cover of darkness and disappearing before dawn. It had been going on for weeks, costing us dozens of heads and making the ranch hands nervous about riding that section alone. Marcus decided to end it by camping out there himself, with a rifle and enough supplies to wait as long as necessary. I argued against it. The rustlers were probably armed and definitely desperate, not the kind of men to go quietly when cornered. But Marcus had that stubborn streak that ran in our family, and he was tired of feeling like thieves were making a fool of him on his own land. "I'm not hiding in the house while criminals steal my cattle," he said, loading his Winchester with the same confidence he did everything else. "A few nights under the stars will remind me why I love this place. And putting some buckshot into those rustlers will remind them why they should find somewhere else to steal from." He rode out on a Tuesday morning, taking his best horse and enough provisions for a week. The plan was simple: wait for the rustlers to show up, then either scare them off or shoot them, depending on how cooperative they felt about leaving. It was a good plan. It should have worked. But Tuesday night, while Marcus was sitting by his campfire, waiting for rustlers who never came, a diamondback rattlesnake decided his bedroll looked like a comfortable place to spend the evening. Marcus woke up with fangs in his leg and venom already burning through his bloodstream. By the time his horse wandered back to the ranch Wednesday morning, riderless and spooked, we knew something had gone wrong. It took 6 hours of searching to find him, and by then the venom had done its work. Marcus Thornfield, heir to the Triple T Ranch and everything our family had built, died alone under the Texas sky because he was too proud to let cattle thieves win. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The funeral was held on a Saturday that dawned bright and clear, with wildflowers blooming across the hillsides and mockingbirds singing in the oak trees. Half the county showed up to pay their respects, filling the church and spilling out into the yard. Marcus had been well liked despite his faults. Generous with his neighbors and fair to his employees, I delivered the eulogy, talking about his love for the land and his dedication to preserving our family's legacy. I didn't mention his stubbornness or his tendency to act without thinking things through. Death has a way of smoothing over a man's rough edges, leaving behind only the good memories and noble intentions. Evangeline sat in the front pew wearing black silk and a veil that couldn't hide her tear-stained face. She'd loved Marcus in her own way, and his death had hit her hard, despite the frustrations in their marriage. I wanted to comfort her, to offer some word or gesture that might ease her grief. But surrounded by all those people, all I could do was speak my rehearsed words about loss and remembrance, while my own heart broke for reasons I couldn't share. After the service, we buried Marcus in the family plot on the hill overlooking the ranch. His grave joined those of our parents and grandparents, marked by a simple headstone that read, "Marcus James Thornfield, beloved husband and son." The preacher said a few words about eternal rest and God's mysterious ways, and then it was over. That's when I noticed Evangeline watching me across the grave, her blue eyes intense despite the tears, and I realized that with Marcus gone, everything was about to change in ways none of us were prepared for. The reading of the will happened the following Tuesday in the lawyer's office in town. Marcus had been thorough in his planning, leaving detailed instructions for the disposition of his property and assets. The ranch went to me as the only surviving male heir, along with all the cattle, equipment, and buildings. It was what everyone expected, what tradition demanded, but Marcus had also made provision for his widow. Evangeline was to receive a generous cash settlement and could remain in the main house for as long as she chose. She would be comfortable for the rest of her life, free to remarry if she found someone suitable, or to live independently, if that was her preference. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was how it would feel for his brother and his wife to suddenly find themselves alone together on a ranch that now belonged to one of them, with no chaperone except propriety and good intentions to keep them apart. The first few weeks after the funeral, we barely spoke except about necessary business. Evangeline retreated to her rooms in the main house, while I moved my things into Marcus's old office and tried to learn the business side of running the ranch. We ate meals separately and avoided being alone together, both of us acutely aware that the careful balance we'd maintained for 3 years had been shattered by Marcus's death. But the ranch didn't run itself, and there were decisions that needed both of our input. Evangeline owned 1/3 of the property outright according to Marcus's will, and major changes required her consent. When rustlers hit the north pasture again 2 weeks after the funeral, we had to discuss hiring additional security. When the cattle buyers from Fort Worth wanted to negotiate a new contract, Evangeline needed to understand the terms, since they affected her financial interests. Those business meetings were torture. Sitting across from her in Marcus's old office, watching her read contracts with the same careful attention she gave everything, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to surround her. I had to constantly remind myself that she was my brother's widow. Not just a woman I'd been in love with for 3 years, she was struggling too. I could see it in the way she'd catch herself staring at me sometimes, in the slight flush that would color her cheeks when our hands accidentally touched, passing papers back and forth. The attraction that had simmered between us while Marcus was alive hadn't died with him. If anything, it had grown stronger, fed by grief and loneliness, and the knowledge that we were no longer bound by the same constraints that had kept us apart. But we were still bound by other things. By respect for Marcus's memory, by what the community would think if his widow took up with his brother so soon after the funeral, by our own guilt over wanting something that felt like a betrayal of the man we'd both loved in our own ways. It was a situation that couldn't last, and we both knew it. Something would have to give, whether that meant Evangeline leaving the ranch to start fresh somewhere, else or both of us finding a way to live with the tension that crackled between us every time we were in the same room. What neither of us anticipated was how the choice would be taken out of our hands by forces beyond our control, and how the consequences would spread far beyond the boundaries of the Triple T ranch. The rustlers hit us again 2 weeks after Marcus's funeral, this time taking 30 heads of prime cattle from the eastern pasture, where we'd moved the herd for better grazing. They came in the pre-dawn darkness, when the night watch was thinnest, cutting out the best steers with the skill of men who knew their business. By the time our hands discovered the theft, the thieves had a 6-hour head start and were long gone into the Badlands, where tracking became nearly impossible. Standing in the churned mud where our cattle had been, studying the hoofprints that told the story of organized theft, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The Triple T was mine now, every blade of grass and head of livestock, every debt and decision. The rustlers weren't just stealing cattle anymore. They were testing the new owner, seeing if Clayton Thornfield had the backbone to protect what was his. 15 riders, maybe 20, said Jake Morrison, my best tracker, and the closest thing I had to a friend among the ranch hands. He was a grizzled man in his 50s who'd worked for my father and knew cattle better than most men knew their own families. Professional job. They knew exactly which animals to take and how to move them fast without spoiling the meat. The other hands stood around us in a loose circle, watching my face for signs of what came next. These were good men who'd worked the Triple T for years, some since before I was born. They'd respected Marcus because he was the owner's son, but they'd follow me only if I proved I could protect their jobs and their lives. Any idea which direction they headed? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Jake pointed northwest, toward a line of hills that marked the beginning of truly wild country. Toward the Comanche Trail, most likely. Rough terrain, plenty of places to hide, and buyers who don't ask questions about brands. I nodded, considering our options. We could organize a pursuit, but chasing armed rustlers into their own territory with a handful of ranch hands was a good way to get men killed. We could report the theft to the territorial marshal, but he was based 200 miles away and had bigger problems than missing cattle. Or we could do what most ranchers did, absorb the loss and hope the thieves moved on to easier targets. But accepting the theft would send the wrong message to every outlaw within 100 miles. Word would spread that the Triple T was weak, that the new owner wouldn't fight for his property. More raids would follow, bolder and more destructive, until we were bled dry. We're going after them, I decided. Jake, pick 5 men who can ride hard and shoot straight. We leave in an hour. The pursuit took us deep into a country I'd never seen before, following a trail that grew fainter with each mile. The rustlers had been clever, splitting their group and driving the cattle through rocky ground where hoofprints disappeared. But Jake's experienced eye could read sign that looked like empty dirt to me. We found their camp on the second day, tucked into a canyon that provided water and concealment. From the ridge above, we could see our stolen cattle penned in a natural corral of fallen rocks, along with animals bearing half a dozen different brands. This wasn't a gang of opportunistic thieves. It was a full-scale rustling operation that had been bleeding ranchers across 3 counties. 12 men down there, Jake whispered, studying the camp through my father's old field glasses. Good horses, new rifles, and enough supplies for a long stay. They're not planning to move anytime soon. I counted our own group, 6 men with hunting rifles and whatever ammunition we'd brought in our saddlebags. Fair odds if we had surprise on our side, but these weren't farmers or shopkeepers we were facing. These were hard men who'd chosen a dangerous profession and survived long enough to get good at it. The smart play would have been to ride back to town, gather a proper posse, and return with overwhelming force. But that would take days, and by then the rustlers and our cattle would be long gone. Sometimes being smart meant being willing to take calculated risks. We waited until just before dawn, when the thieves would be sluggish from sleep and the light would be on our side. The attack went exactly as planned for about 30 seconds. We caught them off guard, dropping 2 sentries before they could raise an alarm, and had good positions among the rocks overlooking their camp. Then everything went to hell. The rustlers weren't green kids or desperate farmers driven to crime by hard times. They were professionals who'd planned for exactly this situation, with escape routes and fallback positions that let them turn our ambush into a running firefight that lasted most of the morning. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the thieves were dead and the rest had melted into the rocks like smoke. We'd recovered our cattle along with most of the other stolen stock, but the victory came at a price. 2 of my men were wounded, 1 seriously, and we'd used most of our ammunition in the process. The ride home took 3 days, slowed by injured men and nervous cattle that spooked at every shadow. But word of our success spread faster than we could travel, carried by other ranchers who'd lost stock to the same gang. By the time we reached the Triple T, I had a reputation as a man who'd fight for what was his. It was exactly the kind of reputation that could get you killed if you weren't careful to live up to it. The ranch hands looked at me differently after that, with the kind of respect that comes from shared danger rather than inherited authority. Jake Morrison started including me in conversations that had been above my station when Marcus was alive. Discussions about cattle prices and weather patterns, and which hands could be trusted with difficult jobs, but the most significant change was in how Evangeline looked at me. She'd been waiting on the porch when we rode in with the recovered cattle. still wearing the black dress she'd put on for Marcus's funeral and hadn't seemed to take off since. The relief on her face when she saw I was unharmed was unmistakable, followed quickly by something that looked like pride. "You brought them back," she said as I dismounted near the porch. "My legs stiff from 3 days in the saddle." "Most of them," I replied, pulling the rifle from its scabbard and checking to make sure it was unloaded. "Lost a few heads in the fighting, but we broke up their operation pretty thoroughly." She stepped closer. Close enough that I could smell the lavender soap she always used. Close enough to see the worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when Marcus was alive. "Jake told me what happened. How you planned the whole thing, how you fought." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the admiration in her voice. "Just doing what needed doing. Can't let thieves think they can steal from us without consequences. Marcus would have done the same thing," she said. But something in her tone suggested that wasn't entirely true. Marcus had been brave enough in his own way, but he'd never been tactical. He would have charged straight into that canyon with all guns blazing, probably getting himself and half his men killed in the process. The thought was disloyal, speaking ill of the dead, but it was also honest. "Maybe," I said diplomatically. Evangeline studied my face for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling she could read thoughts I hadn't spoken. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the bloodstain on my sleeve where a rustler's bullet had grazed my arm. It was barely a scratch, the kind of minor wound that comes with any kind of rough work, but she insisted on cleaning and bandaging it properly. We went into the kitchen where she could work by good light, and I sat at the scarred wooden table where 3 generations of Thornfield men had eaten their meals. Her touch was gentle as she cleaned the wound with carbolic acid that stung worse than the original injury. I tried not to think about how long it had been since a woman had tended to me, tried not to notice the way her hair caught the lamplight or how her dress pulled taut across her shoulders as she worked. "You're lucky it wasn't worse," she said, wrapping clean linen around my arm with practiced efficiency. "Another few inches and it would have shattered bone." "Luck had nothing to do with it," I replied. "I had good cover and better men watching my back." She tied off the bandage and stepped back, but didn't move far enough away to be proper. We were alone in the kitchen, standing closer than we should have been, and suddenly the air felt charged with possibilities that neither of us should have been considering. "Clayton," she began, then stopped as if she'd lost the words. I knew what she wanted to say, because I'd been thinking the same thing, that watching me ride out, not knowing if I'd come back, had been harder than it should have been, that the relief she'd felt seeing me unharmed had been more personal than appropriate for a sister-in-law, that the careful distance we'd maintained since Marcus's death was becoming harder to sustain with each passing day. Instead of finishing her thought, she did something that surprised us both. She leaned forward and kissed my cheek, just beside the corner of my mouth, a gesture that could have been sisterly affection if not for the way her lips lingered against my skin. "Thank you," she whispered, "for protecting what Marcus built, for taking care of all of us." Then she was gone, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the scent of lavender and the memory of her lips against my skin, burning like a brand. That night I lay awake in Marcus's old room, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about the woman sleeping alone in the master bedroom down the hall. The smart thing would be to maintain the boundaries we'd established, to treat her with respect due to my brother's widow and nothing more. But respect was becoming harder to manage when every interaction felt charged with undercurrents that had nothing to do with family loyalty and everything to do with attraction that had been building for 3 years. The problem was that I wasn't the only one who'd noticed the change in our dynamic. Lucinda Fairfax came calling 3 days later, arriving in her family's finest carriage with her mother and enough baggage to suggest an extended visit. The Fairfax spread bordered ours to the south, and Lucinda had been making eyes at Marcus since they were teenagers. His marriage to Evangeline had been a disappointment she'd never quite gotten over. Now, with Marcus dead and me suddenly eligible again, She'd apparently decided to try her luck with the surviving brother. Clayton, she said with a smile that showed too many teeth. I was so sorry to hear about Marcus. He was such a good man. Lucinda was pretty enough in a conventional way, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and the kind of figure that looked good in expensive dresses. She was also educated and well-connected, exactly the sort of wife a successful rancher was supposed to want. Her father owned 5,000 acres and had political connections that could open doors throughout Texas. On paper, she was perfect for me. In reality, talking to her was like trying to have a conversation with a China doll. She had opinions about weather and fashion and little else, and her attempts at flirtation were so obvious they made me uncomfortable. "It's kind of you to call," I said, offering her family the hospitality the situation demanded, while hoping they wouldn't stay long. But Mrs. Fairfax had other plans. "We were hoping you might join us for dinner Sunday," she said, with the confidence of a woman who'd never been refused anything she really wanted. "Lucinda has been learning some new recipes from our cook, and we'd love to have you try them." The invitation was innocent enough on the surface, but everyone in the room understood what it really meant. The Fairfax family was making their intentions known, testing whether I might be interested in a match that would unite two prosperous ranches and provide me with a wife whose reputation was beyond question. It was exactly the kind of practical arrangement that made sense for a man in my position, and I found myself hating the very thought of it. "That's very kind," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure this is the right time for social calls. We're still in mourning for Marcus." Mrs. Fairfax waved away my objection with practiced ease. Of course. But life must go on, mustn't it? Marcus wouldn't want you to isolate yourself indefinitely." She was probably right about that. Marcus had been a social creature who enjoyed parties and gatherings, and he'd have been the first to say that grief shouldn't prevent the living from moving forward. But accepting the Fairfax invitation felt like a betrayal of something I couldn't name. The conversation might have continued in that vein if Evangeline hadn't chosen that moment to enter the parlor carrying a tea service. She moved with the kind of quiet grace that made Lucinda's forced brightness look artificial by comparison, and I noticed how the afternoon light caught the red highlights in her auburn hair. "Mrs. Fairfax." "Miss Fairfax," she said with perfect politeness, though I caught a slight tightening around her eyes. "How lovely to see you." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the two women took each other's measure. Lucinda's smile became a shade more forced, while Mrs. Fairfax studied Evangeline with the calculating gaze of a woman assessing potential competition. "Mrs. Thornfield," Mrs. Fairfax replied. "You're looking well, considering your recent loss." It was a perfectly proper thing to say, but somehow it managed to sound vaguely insulting. Evangeline's spine straightened almost imperceptibly, and I recognized the warning signs of a confrontation brewing between two strong-willed women. "Thank you," Evangeline said smoothly. "I find that staying busy helps with the grief. There's so much to manage on a ranch this size." The implication was clear. She wasn't just a decorative widow waiting to be remarried, but an active partner in running the Triple T. It was a subtle but unmistakable claim to territory that Lucinda obviously wanted for herself. "Oh, but surely you won't continue to burden yourself with such concerns," Lucinda said with false sympathy. "Running a ranch is such difficult work for a woman alone. I'm sure Clayton could find someone to help manage the domestic arrangements." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, their meaning impossible to miss. Lucinda was suggesting that Evangeline's role at the Triple T was temporary, that she'd need to be replaced by someone more suitable, namely, a new wife for the ranch's owner. I saw Evangeline's jaw tighten and knew I had to intervene before the conversation turned openly hostile. "Evangeline has been invaluable in helping me learn the business side of operations," I said firmly. "Marcus trusted her judgment completely, and so did I." It was the truth, but it was also a declaration of loyalty that neither of the Fairfax women could have missed. I was making it clear that Evangeline's position at the Triple T was secure, and that any woman who wanted to be part of my life would have to accept that fact. Lucinda's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place with renewed brightness. Of course. How wonderful that you have such support during this difficult time. The visit concluded shortly afterward with renewed invitations and vague promises to call again soon. As their carriage disappeared down the long drive to the main road, I found myself standing on the porch with Evangeline, watching the dust settle in their wake. "She's setting her cap for you," Evangeline observed quietly. "I noticed. She'd make you a good wife. Her family has money and connections, and she's been properly educated. Most men would consider themselves lucky to have such an opportunity. There was something in her tone that I couldn't quite identify. Resignation, perhaps, or sadness masked as practical acceptance. She was right about Lucinda's qualifications, just as she was right that most men in my position would jump at the chance to align themselves with the Fairfax family. "Most men aren't me," I said. Evangeline turned to look at me, and for a moment her careful composure slipped enough to show the vulnerability underneath. "What are you saying, Clayton?" I should have deflected the question, made some joke about not being ready for marriage so soon after losing my brother. Instead, I found myself saying something far more dangerous. I'm saying that some things matter, more than money and connections. The silence that followed was loaded with implications that neither of us was quite ready to voice. We stood there on the porch where Marcus had courted her 3 years earlier, where he'd asked her to marry him and she'd said yes, and felt the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. "Clayton," she began, but whatever she'd planned to say was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, riding hard from the direction of the north pasture. "Boss," he called as he reined in his lathered horse. "We got trouble." Big trouble. The rustlers, it turned out, had friends. Jake's report was grim. A larger gang had hit the north pasture in broad daylight, taking 50 head of cattle and shooting 2 of our hands who'd tried to stop them. Both men were alive but hurt bad, and the thieves had left a message carved into a fence post. This is what happens to folks who don't mind their own business. Standing in the barn where we'd carried the wounded men, watching Evangeline tend their injuries with the same gentle efficiency she'd shown caring for my minor wound, I realized that my reputation for fighting back had made us a target rather than earning us respect. The next phase of our troubles was just beginning, and this time the stakes would be higher than stolen cattle or wounded pride. This time people were going to die, and the choices we made in the coming days would determine whether the Triple T survived or became another failed dream buried in Texas dirt. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when the September heat was already making the air shimmer like water above the pastures. I was in the corral breaking a young stallion that had more spirit than sense when I saw the dust cloud of an approaching rider. The postal courier from town came out to the ranch maybe once a month, usually carrying bills or business correspondence that could wait. This time felt different. Evangeline met the courier at the front gate, signing for a letter that made her face go white as fresh cotton. I watched from across the yard as she read it once, then again, her hands trembling so badly the paper rustled like autumn leaves. "Clayton," she called, her voice cracking on my name. I vaulted over the corral fence and crossed to her in long strides, taking the letter she held out with shaking fingers. The handwriting was feminine and hurried, the kind of script that comes from someone writing bad news as fast as possible to get it over with. "Evangeline," it read, "come quickly. Mama took sick 3 days ago with terrible stomach pains. Dr. Patterson says it might be cancer. She's asking for you. Please hurry. Your loving sister, Caroline." The letter was dated 5 days earlier, which meant it had taken the better part of a week to reach us. If Mrs. Meadows was as sick as Caroline suggested, Evangeline might already be too late. "I have to go," Evangeline said, though her voice suggested she already knew the problems with that plan. "The next stage to Austin doesn't leave until Friday, and that's 4 days away." She might not. Her voice broke entirely. I knew what she couldn't bring herself to say. Mrs. Meadows might not live 4 more days. And even if she did, the stagecoach took the better part of a week to make the journey to Austin, stopping at every settlement along the way and moving no faster than the worst roads would allow. But a good horse and an experienced rider could make Austin in 2 days. Maybe less if they pushed hard and knew the shortcuts through country the stage couldn't navigate. "I'll take you," I said. The words coming out before I'd fully thought through what I was offering. Evangeline stared at me like I'd suggested we sprout wings and fly. "Clayton, you can't. People would—" She trailed off. But we both knew what people would say about a widow traveling alone with her dead husband's brother. In the 3 months since Marcus's funeral, we'd been scrupulously careful about appearances. Never alone together for more than a few minutes, never touching except for the most formal handshakes, always maintaining the proper distance that society expected between a man and his sister-in-law. The careful dance had become second nature, even as it grew more difficult with each passing day. But watching Evangeline's face crumple with grief and desperation, thinking about her mother dying alone while bureaucratic schedules kept her daughter away, I found I didn't care what people would say. "Your mother is dying," I said firmly. "Nothing else matters." The tears came then, not the dignified weeping of a lady, but the raw sobs of a daughter who might lose her last chance to say goodbye. Without thinking, I pulled her into my arms, holding her against my chest while she cried out 3 months of accumulated grief and loneliness. She felt small and fragile in my embrace, nothing like the composed woman who'd been managing household accounts and entertaining neighbors' wives. For the first time since Marcus's death, the careful walls between us came down, and I allowed myself to comfort her the way I'd wanted to all along. "We'll leave at first light," I murmured against her hair. "I promise we'll get you there in time." We spent the rest of the day preparing for a journey that would test both our endurance and our reputations. I selected the 2 strongest horses in our remuda, animals with the speed and stamina to cover ground quickly without breaking down. Evangeline packed light but practical, extra clothes, medical supplies, and enough money to buy fresh horses if ours gave out. The ranch hands accepted my explanation that family business required my immediate attention, though I caught Jake Morrison giving me a long, measured look that suggested he understood more than he was letting on. "You be careful out there, boss," he said, as I checked my rifle for the 3rd time. "The country between here and Austin can be hard on travelers, especially folks carrying cash money." He was right to be concerned. The route to Austin passed through some of the wildest territory in Texas, with plenty of places for bandits to set up ambushes and few settlements where travelers could find help. But the alternative was letting Evangeline make the journey alone, or miss her mother's death entirely, and neither option was acceptable. We left the ranch before dawn, riding east through a country that looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Rolling hills covered with blue stem grass and scattered oak groves stretched to the horizon, with no sign of the dangers that could lurk in such a beautiful landscape. Evangeline rode better than I'd expected, keeping pace without complaint even when the terrain turned rough. She'd changed from her usual dresses into a practical riding habit that had belonged to my mother, dark blue wool that wouldn't show dust, and was cut for serious travel rather than social occasions. We had a good time the first day, covering nearly 40 miles before stopping to rest the horses at a creek lined with cottonwood trees. The animals needed water and grazing, and we needed to eat something before pushing on through the afternoon heat. "Tell me about your mother," I said, as we shared cold biscuits and jerky in the shade. Evangeline's face softened with memory. She came to Texas as a mail-order bride when she was barely 17. Grandfather had arranged her marriage to a man she'd never met, a farmer who needed a wife and promised to treat her well. She told me stories I'd never heard before. Tales of her mother's struggles adapting to frontier life after growing up in a comfortable Virginia household. learning to cook over an open fire, treating snake bites and fever, delivering babies when the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away. She lost her first husband to cholera when Caroline was just a baby, Evangeline continued. Married again for practical reasons more than love, to my father. He was a good man, but distant. I don't think Mama ever really loved him the way a woman should love her husband. There was something in her tone that made me look at her more closely. What do you mean? Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, staring at the creek where our horses were drinking. She told me once that she'd settled for security instead of passion, and that she regretted it. She said life was too short to marry for practical reasons, when your heart wanted something else. The words hung between us like smoke, heavy with implications neither of us was ready to address directly. But I understood what she was really telling me, just as she understood why I'd been willing to risk my reputation to bring her here. We remounted and pushed on through the afternoon, following cattle trails and old deer paths that cut miles off the main roads. The country grew wilder as we traveled, with fewer signs of settlement and more evidence of the predators that made such territory dangerous. It was near sunset when we saw the smoke. A thin column rising from behind a line of hills ahead. Too much smoke for a campfire, but not the black billows that would indicate a serious blaze. I reined in my horse and studied the horizon, trying to decide whether to investigate or find another route. What is it? Evangeline asked, following my gaze. Trouble, most likely. I made my decision quickly. We'll swing south and avoid whatever's making that smoke. Better to add miles than ride into problems we can't handle. But as we changed direction, a new sound reached us in the evening wind. Gunshots, faint but unmistakable, coming from the same direction as the smoke. Someone's in trouble, Evangeline said quietly. She was right. And every instinct I'd developed in 3 years of protecting the Triple T told me to help if we could. But I also had responsibilities to the woman riding beside me, and walking into an unknown fight was a good way to get us both killed. The decision was taken out of my hands when 3 riders appeared on the ridge ahead of us, silhouetted against the orange sky like harbingers of doom. Even at a distance, I could see they were armed and riding hard in our direction. Bandits, I said, reaching for my rifle. Or worse. We spurred our horses toward a stand of live oaks that would provide some cover, but the other riders had seen us and were closing fast. There was no time for elaborate tactics, only the desperate hope that we could reach defensible ground before they reached us. The chase lasted maybe 10 minutes, our horses stretching out in full gallop across uneven ground that could break a leg with one wrong step. Behind us, the bandits gained steadily, their fresher mounts making up distance with each stride. We reached the oak grove just as the first shots rang out, bullets whining through the branches above our heads as we dove from our saddles and took cover behind the largest trees. "Stay down," I told Evangeline, jacking around into my rifle's chamber. "And if something happens to me, take my horse and ride hard for Austin. Don't stop for anything." The fight that followed was brief but vicious. 3 desperate men against 1 rifle, and whatever protection the trees could provide. I managed to drop one of them with my second shot, but the other 2 had found cover of their own and were content to wait us out. It might have ended badly if not for the arrival of unexpected help. A 4th rider appeared from the direction of the smoke, wearing a badge that caught the last rays of sunlight and carrying a shotgun that spoke with authority. "Texas Rangers," he called out. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands visible." The remaining bandits tried to run for it, but their horses were blown from the chase and the ranger's mount was fresh. Both men were dead within minutes, shot down as they fled toward whatever hole they'd crawled out of. The ranger turned out to be a weathered man named Tom Bradley, who'd been tracking the gang for 2 weeks. They'd been hitting travelers along the Austin Road, killing anyone who fought back and leaving the bodies for the buzzards. "You folks were lucky," he said, as we shared his coffee around a small fire. "These boys had notches on their guns for a reason. You wouldn't have been the first to die on this trail." Evangeline had remained silent through most of the encounter, but I could see the strain in her face. She'd probably never been so close to violence before, certainly never been shot at by men who meant to kill her. "We're trying to reach Austin," I explained. "Family emergency." Bradley nodded, understanding. "I'll ride with you as far as the crossroads." The country gets safer once you're within a day's ride of town. We spent the night under the stars, with the ranger keeping watch while Evangeline and I tried to sleep on opposite sides of the dying fire. But sleep was impossible, with adrenaline still singing in my veins, and the knowledge that we'd almost died together, making every glance between us feel charged with meaning. When she cried out in her sleep, caught in some nightmare about bullets and blood, I crossed the space between our bedrolls without thinking and gathered her into my arms. "It's all right," I whispered against her hair. "We're safe now." She clung to me in the darkness, her face buried against my chest, her body trembling with delayed shock and grief, and something else that had nothing to do with fear. "Clayton," she breathed, and when she lifted her face to mine, her lips were inches away. The kiss was inevitable. 3 years of suppressed longing, and tonight's brush with death, combining to tear down the last of our restraint. Her mouth was soft and desperate under mine, her hands tangling in my hair as we forgot everything except the need to feel alive after coming so close to dying. We broke apart when the ranger stirred in his sleep, reality crashing back down like a bucket of cold water. But the damage was done. The line we'd been so careful not to cross had been obliterated, and there was no pretending it hadn't happened. "We can't," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," she whispered back, but her eyes said something different. We reached Austin the next evening, dusty and exhausted from 2 days of hard riding. Evangeline's sister Caroline met us at their mother's house, a small frame building on the outskirts of town that looked like it had seen better days. "You made it," Caroline said, embracing her sister with obvious relief. "I wasn't sure the letter would reach you in time." Mrs. Meadows was dying quietly, surrounded by her daughters and the few possessions she'd accumulated in 60 years of frontier life. She was a tiny woman, bird-like and fragile, but her eyes were still sharp when she looked at me. "So you're Clayton," she said in a voice like rustling leaves. "The one who brought my daughter home to me." She died the next morning, peacefully and with dignity, leaving behind 2 daughters who'd loved her and a lifetime of memories that would have to sustain them through the grief to come. The funeral was small but respectful, and afterward, Caroline asked Evangeline to stay in Austin, to make a fresh start, away from the complications of ranch life. "You could teach school again," she urged. "Or we could open a dress shop together. There's nothing keeping you in that wild country now." For a moment I thought Evangeline might accept. It would have been the sensible thing, the proper thing, and it would have saved us both from the impossible situation we'd created. Instead, she looked at me across her mother's grave and said, "My home is with the Triple T now. That's where I belong." The journey back to Texas took 3 days instead of 2. Both of us reluctant to return to a world where we'd have to pretend that Kiss had never happened. But return we did, riding through the front gate of the Triple T just as the sun was setting behind the hills. Jake Morrison was waiting for us in the yard, his face grim with news that would change everything yet again. "We got visitors while you were gone, boss," he said. "The sheriff and some federal marshals. They want to talk to you about those rustlers you killed. Seems like somebody's been spreading stories about what really happened out there." Standing in the yard of the ranch that had been my family's legacy for 4 generations, looking at the woman who'd become the center of my world despite every reason why she shouldn't be, I realized that our troubles were just beginning. The kiss we'd shared under the stars had been the point of no return, but the consequences were still coming home to roost. The federal marshals were waiting in my office when I walked in the next morning. 2 hard-faced men in dark suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else than a dusty ranch in the middle of Texas. Sheriff Morrison sat behind my own desk like he owned the place. studying papers that I was pretty sure he had no legal right to be reading. Clayton Thornfield, the older marshal said, standing when I entered. I'm Marshal Davis. This is Marshal Webb. We need to discuss the incident with the rustlers last month. I poured myself coffee from the pot Evangeline had left warming on the stove, taking my time to think through what this visit might really be about. The rustler raid had been clean and legal. Thieves caught red-handed, killed in the act of resisting lawful recovery of stolen property. But federal marshals didn't ride out from Austin for routine cattle rustling. What's to discuss? I asked, settling into the chair across from my own desk. We tracked down men who stole our cattle. They chose to fight instead of surrender, and they lost. End of story. Marshal Davis opened a leather folder and pulled out what looked like wanted posters. Problem is, one of the men you killed was Billy Craddock, wanted for robbing a federal payroll shipment outside San Antonio. There was a $500 reward on his head. I studied the poster he handed me. The drawing was rough, but it could have been the man Jake shot during our assault on the Canyon camp. So we did the federal government a favor. I'm sure you can find our address to send the reward money. That's not quite how it works. Marshal Webb spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a Boston accent that sounded out of place in cattle country. Federal fugitives are supposed to be taken alive when possible. Questions need to be asked about what Craddock was doing in this area, who he might have been working with. The real purpose of their visit was becoming clear. Billy Craddock hadn't just been any rustler. He'd been connected to something bigger, possibly organized crime that crossed state lines and involved federal jurisdiction. Now they wanted to know what he might have told us before he died, information that could lead them to bigger fish. We didn't exactly have time for interrogation, I said dryly. They were shooting at us from a good cover. Taking them alive wasn't really an option. Sheriff Morrison finally spoke up, his tone apologetic but firm. The thing is, Clayton, there's been talk around town. Some folks say you were mighty quick to organize that pursuit, mighty eager to take justice into your own hands instead of waiting for proper law enforcement. I felt my jaw tighten. Some folks have short memories about who lost cattle and who got them back. Now, nobody's questioning your right to recover your property, Marshal Davis said carefully. But there are proper procedures for dealing with interstate criminal activity. When federal fugitives are involved, local ranchers can't just ride out and settle things with gunfire. The conversation continued for another hour, with the marshals asking detailed questions about the raid, the Canyon camp, and everything we'd found there. They seemed particularly interested in any papers or personal effects we might have recovered, anything that could provide clues about Craddock's associates or future plans. I answered honestly but carefully, describing the fight exactly as it had happened, while avoiding any mention of the personal reasons that had driven my decision to pursue the rustlers so aggressively. Telling them that I'd needed to prove myself as the new owner of the Triple T would only raise more questions about my judgment and motivations. When they finally left, I found Evangeline waiting on the front porch, her face pale with worry. She'd obviously been listening from the house, and she understood the implications as well as I did. They think you acted recklessly, she said quietly. They think I acted outside federal jurisdiction, I corrected. Which might be true, but it doesn't make what we did wrong. She moved closer, close enough that I could smell the lavender soap she always used, close enough to see the concern in her blue eyes. Clayton, what if they tried to charge you with something? What if? I stopped her words with a finger against her lips, a gesture that was far too intimate for a man and his sister-in-law, but felt natural after what we'd shared under the stars 3 nights ago. Nothing's going to happen, I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Federal marshals have bigger problems than one dead rustler, even if he was wanted for other crimes. But Evangeline had grown up on the frontier, and she understood how quickly things could change when law enforcement decided to make an example of someone. What about the ranch? What about all the people who depend on us for their livelihoods? It was a fair question, The Triple T employed 15 ranch hands year-round, plus seasonal workers during roundup and calving season. Their families depended on those wages, just as the local businesses in town depended on our trade. If I were arrested or forced to sell the ranch to pay legal fees, a lot of innocent people would suffer. We'll face that if it happens, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The next few weeks passed in an atmosphere of increasing tension. Word of the federal investigation spread through the county, despite our attempts to keep it quiet, and I could feel people watching me differently. Some with sympathy, understanding that I'd done what any rancher would do to protect his property. Others with suspicion, wondering if there was more to the story than they'd been told. The Fairfax family made their position clear by withdrawing their dinner invitation and avoiding me at church on Sunday. Lucinda's flirtation stopped entirely, replaced by cool politeness that made it obvious her family no longer considered me suitable marriage material for their daughter. Ironically, the federal investigation had solved one problem by creating a bigger one, but the real crisis came from an unexpected direction, triggered by someone I'd trusted completely. Jake Morrison found me in the barn 3 weeks after the marshal's visit. His weathered face grim with news that would shatter the careful balance Evangeline and I had maintained since returning from Austin. "Boss, we need to talk," he said, glancing around to make sure we couldn't be overheard. "About you and Mrs. Thornfield." My blood went cold. "What about us?" Jake pulled off his hat and ran his fingers through gray hair that had seen 40 years of Texas sun and wind. "Look, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I respected your brother like he was my own son. So what I'm about to say comes from a place of caring, not judgment. I waited knowing that whatever came next would change everything. People are talking," Jake continued, "about how close you two have gotten since Marcus died. About that trip to Austin, traveling alone together for days. About the way you look at each other when you think nobody's watching. People need to mind their own business," I said, but the words sounded weak even to me. Jake nodded grimly. "Maybe so. But when the widow Patterson saw you and Mrs. Thornfield holding hands on the front porch last Tuesday evening, minding their own business became a lot harder." The memory hit me like a physical blow. Evangeline had been telling me about a letter from her sister, something inconsequential about settling their mother's estate. But she'd been standing close, and when she'd reached out to touch my arm for emphasis, I'd caught her hand in mine without thinking. It had lasted maybe 30 seconds, an innocent gesture between two people who'd shared grief and danger and growing attraction. But to someone watching from the road, someone looking for scandal to gossip about, it would have looked exactly like what it was, a man and woman who cared for each other more than propriety allowed. "Mrs. Patterson's been talking to anyone who'll listen," Jake continued relentlessly, "about how it ain't natural for a widow and her brother-in-law to be living alone in the same house. About how maybe Marcus's death was mighty convenient for some people. The accusation hit me like a slap across the face. You think I killed my own brother? I think you're a good man who's gotten himself into an impossible situation," Jake said quietly. "But what I think doesn't matter if the law starts wondering about convenient deaths and suspicious relationships." He was right, and we both knew it. In a community where reputation was everything and gossip traveled faster than telegraph messages, even unfounded suspicions could destroy lives. And if federal marshals already looking for reasons to question my judgment got wind of rumors about improper relationships and convenient deaths. "What do you suggest?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. Jake replaced his hat and settled it firmly on his head. "One of you needs to leave, soon, before this gets any worse." That evening I found Evangeline in the garden behind the house, tending to the roses she'd planted during her first year as Marcus's wife. She looked up when she heard my footsteps on the gravel path, and one look at my face told her that something had changed. "What's happened?" I told her about my conversation with Jake about Mrs. Patterson's gossip and the growing whispers that were beginning to follow us both. I watched her face go pale as she understood the implications. The way small-town suspicions could snowball into something that destroyed everything we'd tried to build. "They think we killed Marcus," she said quietly. Not a question, but a statement of terrible understanding. "They think we wanted him dead," I corrected, which in the eyes of the law might amount to the same thing. Evangeline sank onto the stone bench Marcus had built for her 3rd anniversary, her hands trembling as they gripped the worn granite.
"What are we going to do?"
I sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close that we'd give any watching neighbors more ammunition for their gossip. "Jake thinks one of us should leave. Start over somewhere else before this gets worse. And what do you think?" I looked around the garden she'd created, at the house where 4 generations of Thornfields had been born and raised, at the land that had been our family's life for nearly a century. The thought of losing it all because of gossip and suspicion made my chest tight with something between rage and despair. "I think we're damned if we do, and damned if we don't," I said honestly. "Stay, and we'll be living under constant suspicion, watching every word and gesture for the rest of our lives. Leave, and we'll be confirming every ugly rumor people want to believe." Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, studying her hands as if they held answers to questions we couldn't bear to ask directly. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's a 3rd option." I waited. Though part of me already knew what she was going to say, "We could make it true," she said, meeting my eyes for the first time since we'd sat down. "What they're all whispering about. What we've been pretending we don't feel." The suggestion hung between us like a loaded gun, dangerous and tempting and absolutely impossible to ignore. After months of careful distance and suppressed longing, she was offering to tear down every wall we'd built between ourselves and our desires. "Evangeline," I began, but she cut me off with a gesture. "I know what you're going to say. That it's too soon after Marcus's death, that people will talk, that it would dishonor his memory. But they're already talking, Clayton. They already think the worst of us. Maybe it's time to stop caring what they think and start caring about what we want." She was right, and we both knew it. The careful propriety we'd maintained had brought us nothing but suspicion and isolation. If we were going to be condemned for loving each other, we might as well have the consolation of actually doing it. But accepting her offer would mean crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, making choices that would echo through the rest of our lives and the lives of everyone connected to the Triple T Ranch. I was still struggling with an answer when the sound of approaching horses made us both look toward the front of the house. 3 riders were coming up the drive, and even at a distance I could see the federal marshal badges that caught the last rays of evening sunlight. They weren't here for a social call. "Mrs. Thornfield," Marshal Davis said as they reined in near the porch, "we'd like to speak with you privately, if you don't mind, about your late husband's death." The interrogation took place in what had once been Marcus's private study, a room lined with leather-bound books he'd never read and hunting trophies from expeditions that had meant more to him than running the ranch. Marshal Davis sat behind the mahogany desk while his partner took notes, and I was relegated to a chair in the corner like a witness to my own life falling apart. Evangeline faced their questions with the same quiet dignity she'd shown at Marcus's funeral, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the arms of her chair whenever they asked about the timeline of his death. "According to the coroner's report," Marshal Davis said, consulting a folder thick with official documents, "your husband died from complications of a rattlesnake bite. But there are some inconsistencies in the witness statements that we'd like to clarify." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Evangeline's voice remained steady, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that meant she was fighting to maintain control. Marshal Webb looked up from his notes. "Well, ma'am, several of the ranch hands mentioned that your husband had been acting strangely in the weeks before his death. Drinking more than usual, staying out all night, talking about proving himself to people who doubted him. I felt my jaw clench. They were twisting Marcus's determination to catch the rustlers into something darker, making it sound like he'd been unstable or desperate rather than simply stubborn and proud. My husband was frustrated about the cattle thieves, Evangeline said carefully. Any rancher would be upset about losing livestock to rustlers. But not every rancher decides to camp out alone in dangerous territory with minimal supplies and no backup plan, Davis replied. According to your brother-in-law here, he argued against the idea, said it was too risky. The trap was becoming visible now. They were painting a picture of Marcus as emotionally unstable, making reckless decisions that led to his death, while I was the voice of reason who'd tried to stop him. Combined with the gossip about Evangeline and me, it created a narrative where we'd both benefit from Marcus's demise. I did think it was dangerous, I said, unable to keep quiet any longer. But Marcus was the owner of this ranch. He had the right to make decisions about how to protect it, even if I disagreed with those decisions. Marshal Davis turned his cold gaze on me. Convenient that you were so concerned about his safety, considering how quickly you stepped into his role after the funeral. Someone had to run the ranch. The cattle don't take care of themselves, and someone had to comfort his widow, I suppose. Webb's question carried implications that made my blood boil. Before I could respond with something that would probably land me in jail, Evangeline spoke up with ice in her voice. Marshal, if you have specific accusations to make, please make them. If not, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop insulting my late husband's memory and my own reputation with your insinuations. Davis leaned back in Marcus's chair, studying us both with the calculating gaze of a man who'd made a career of reading people's secrets. Here's what we know, Mrs. Thornfield. Your husband dies under suspicious circumstances, leaving his ranch to his twin brother. That same brother has been sharing your household ever since, traveling alone with you to Austin, and according to several witnesses, behaving in ways that suggest your relationship goes beyond family obligation. That's enough, I said, standing up despite Webb's hand moving toward his gun. You're talking about a woman who just lost her mother and her husband within months of each other. Show some respect. Respect? Davis's voice turned sharp. We're investigating a possible murder, Mr. Thornfield. Federal fugitive Billy Craddock wasn't just stealing cattle. He was part of a larger operation that's been moving stolen livestock, laundered money, and other contraband through this area for months. Your convenient raid that killed him and several potential witnesses has complicated our investigation considerably. The room went silent, except for the ticking of Marcus's old mantel clock. I could feel Evangeline's eyes on me, could see her putting together pieces of a puzzle that neither of us had fully understood until this moment. You think Marcus was involved with the rustlers, she said quietly. Davis nodded grimly. We think your husband might have been taking payment to look the other way, while they used Triple T land as a corridor for moving stolen goods. When he started talking about catching them himself, he became a liability that needed to be eliminated. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Marcus had his faults, pride, stubbornness, a tendency to act without thinking, but he wasn't a criminal. The idea that he'd been working with the same thieves who'd been stealing our cattle was absurd. That's impossible, I said. Marcus would never, wouldn't he? Webb interrupted, consulting his notes. Ranch has been struggling financially for 2 years. Cattle prices down, drought conditions affecting grazing, several large debts coming due. A man in that situation might be willing to make compromises he wouldn't normally consider. Evangeline's face had gone white. Our finances are private. How do you know about our debts? Federal investigation gives us access to banking records, ma'am. Your husband owed substantial money to 3 different lenders, with payments coming due that would have been difficult to meet through legitimate ranch income alone. I stared at Marshal Davis, pieces of information I'd never connected before, suddenly forming a terrible picture. Marcus's frequent trips to town, the business meetings he'd mentioned but never explained in detail, The way he'd brushed off my questions about ranch finances by saying he had everything under control. Even if that were true, Evangeline said, her voice shaking slightly, it doesn't mean Clayton and I had anything to do with his death. Marcus was bitten by a rattlesnake. Animals don't follow human conspiracies. Davis smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Funny thing about rattlesnakes, Mrs. Thornfield. They're not usually aggressive unless they're cornered or threatened. Most folks who get bitten were doing something foolish, like reaching into places they shouldn't, or walking around in the dark without proper caution. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that a man who knew the territory as well as your husband did wouldn't normally make the kind of mistakes that lead to fatal snake bites. Unless, of course, he was distracted by other concerns, or unless someone wanted to make sure he made those mistakes. The implication was clear and horrifying. They weren't just suggesting that Marcus had been involved with criminals. They were suggesting that someone had deliberately put him in a position where he'd be killed, either by arranging for him to encounter the snake or by ensuring he'd be too distracted to notice the danger until it was too late. You're talking about murder, I said flatly. We're talking about a very convenient death that solved several problems for several people, Davis replied. A husband who might have been planning to confess his criminal activities dies before he can implicate anyone else. A brother inherits a valuable ranch. A young widow finds herself free to pursue relationships that would have been impossible while her husband was alive. Evangeline stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. Get out. Both of you. If you want to ask me any more questions, you can do it through a lawyer. That's your right, ma'am, Davis said, gathering his papers with deliberate slowness. But running us off won't make the questions go away. This investigation is far from over. They left with promises to return and warnings about not leaving the county without permission. As their horses disappeared down the drive, Evangeline and I stood in the study that still smelled of Marcus's pipe tobacco, trying to process accusations that threatened to destroy everything we'd built and everything we'd hoped to build. Did you know? She asked quietly. About the financial problems? I suspected things were tight, but I didn't know how bad. I slumped into Marcus's chair, feeling the weight of responsibilities I'd never asked for. He always said he had everything under control, that the ranch would weather any difficulties. But you never thought he might be involved with criminals. Never! The word came out with absolute conviction. Marcus was proud and stubborn and sometimes foolish, but he wasn't dishonest. If he'd been taking money from rustlers, I would have known. Evangeline moved to the window that looked out over the pastures, where our remaining cattle grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. What if you're wrong? What if Marcus was more desperate than either of us realized? The question hung between us like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. If Marcus had been involved with the rustlers, it would explain some things that had never made sense. The gang's detailed knowledge of our herd movements, their ability to strike when the fewest hands were on duty, the way they'd seemed to know exactly which cattle to take for maximum profit. But it would also mean that everything we thought we knew about him was wrong, that the man we'd both loved in our own ways had been living a lie that ultimately got him killed. Even if he was, I said slowly, it doesn't change what we feel for each other. It doesn't make us murderers. Evangeline turned from the window, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. Doesn't it? If we wanted him gone, if we wished we could be together without the complications of his existence, doesn't that make us guilty of something, even if we never acted on it? The honesty of her question cut deep because it forced me to confront thoughts I'd tried not to acknowledge even to myself. Had there been moments, during the 3 years of careful distance and suppressed longing, when I'd wished Marcus would simply disappear? Had I ever imagined scenarios where circumstances might free Evangeline to choose differently? Wanting something doesn't make you guilty of causing it, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Tell that to the federal marshals. Tell that to the people in town who are already convinced we're guilty of adultery and murder. She moved away from the window, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "We're trapped, Clayton. Even if we could prove our innocence, the suspicion will follow us forever." She was right, and we both knew it. In a community where reputation was everything, being accused of such crimes was almost as damaging as being convicted of them. People would always wonder, always whisper, always look at us with speculation and judgment. "So what do you want to do?" I asked. Evangeline stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "I want to tell you something I should have said months ago. Something I should have said before Marcus died, but I was too much of a coward." My heart started beating faster, though I tried to keep my face neutral. "What? I love you," she said simply. "I've loved you since that first Christmas, when you taught me to play chess and listened to my opinions about books that Marcus dismissed as foolish women's reading. I married the wrong brother, Clayton, and I've regretted it every day since." The confession hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was unexpected, but because hearing it said aloud made it real in a way that stolen glances and careful touches never had. "Evangeline—" "I'm not finished," she interrupted. "I know you love me too. I've known it for years, even when we were both pretending otherwise. And I know that makes us terrible people, loving each other while Marcus was alive, but I can't regret it anymore. Life is too short and too uncertain to waste time on regrets." I stood up and crossed to her, taking her hands in mine, despite every rational voice in my head screaming warnings about propriety and consequences. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly, but they gripped mine with desperate strength. "I do love you," I said. "God help me. I've loved you since the day Marcus brought you home as his bride. But loving you and acting on that love are two different things, are they?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The marshals think we're already guilty. The town thinks we're already sinning. Maybe it's time to stop caring what they think and start caring about what we want." She was offering me everything I'd dreamed of for 3 years. Her love, her body, her partnership in building a life together. But accepting that offer would mean abandoning any pretense of honoring Marcus's memory, confirming every ugly suspicion that had been whispered about us. Before I could answer, the sound of horses approaching made us both freeze. Through the study window, I could see Jake Morrison riding hard toward the house, his face grim with urgency that meant trouble was coming fast. I released Evangeline's hands and moved to meet Jake at the front door, dreading whatever news had brought him racing back from town with such obvious distress. "Boss," he said, swinging down from his lathered horse, "we got big problems. Word's gotten out about the federal investigation, and people are talking ugly. Real ugly. What kind of talk?" Jake glanced at Evangeline, who'd followed me onto the porch, then back to me. "There's a group forming up in town, led by Harold Fairfax and some of the other big ranchers. They're saying the Triple T has brought shame on the whole county, that harboring criminals and murderers makes all the honest ranchers look bad." My blood went cold. "What are they planning?" "They want you both gone. Tonight. They're giving you until sunset to pack up and leave Texas permanently, or they'll come out here and settle things their own way." The ultimatum was exactly what I'd been dreading since the marshal's first visit. In frontier justice, being accused of serious crimes was often enough to get you driven out of town or worse, regardless of what the courts might eventually decide. "How many men?" I asked. 20, maybe more. Armed and angry, talking about protecting their community from corruption. Jake's weathered face was creased with worry. "Boss, I've known you since you were a boy, and I'd stand with you against any trouble. But 20 armed men isn't an odds we can beat, especially not when half the county thinks you're guilty of something." Evangeline moved closer to me, her hand finding mine in a gesture that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances, but now seemed natural and necessary. "We could run," she said quietly. "Take what we can carry and head for California or Colorado. Start over somewhere nobody knows our names, and leave the Triple T to Harold Fairfax." I shook my head. "This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. I won't be driven off by gossip and threats." "Then what?" Jake asked. "Because those men will be here in a few hours, and they're not coming to talk." I looked out over the land that had been my family's legacy, the rolling pastures and distant hills that had shaped every day of my life since childhood. The thought of abandoning it all, of letting vindictive neighbors steal what my grandfather had built with his own hands, filled me with rage that bordered on desperation. But staying meant fighting, and fighting meant people would die. Some of them would be men I'd known all my life, neighbors who'd attended Marcus's funeral and shared meals at our table during better times. "There's another option," Evangeline said, her voice gaining strength as an idea took shape. "We could tell them the truth." "What truth?" She turned to face me fully, her blue eyes blazing with sudden determination. "That we love each other, that we're going to be married as soon as decency allows, that we had nothing to do with Marcus's death or any criminal activity, but we're not going to apologize for finding happiness after tragedy." The suggestion was either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. By announcing our intention to marry, we'd be acknowledging the relationship that everyone suspected, but giving it legitimacy through future vows. It wouldn't satisfy those who'd already decided we were guilty, but it might undermine their moral authority to drive us out. "They'll say we're proving their point," I warned. "That we wanted Marcus dead so we could be together." "Let them say it," Evangeline replied firmly. "We know the truth, and that has to be enough. I'm tired of hiding what I feel. I'm tired of pretending I don't love the best man I've ever known, just because small-minded people can't tell the difference between love and murder." Jake cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Begging your pardon, Ma'am, but declaring your love won't stop bullets if those men decide you're guilty anyway." He was right, of course. Noble gestures were poor protection against mob justice, and 20 angry men with rifles wouldn't be deterred by speeches about love and legitimacy. But as I looked at Evangeline's face, seeing the courage and determination there, I realized that running would mean spending the rest of our lives as fugitives from accusations we couldn't disprove. At least standing our ground gave us a chance to control our own fate. "Jake," I said, "how many hands would stand with us if it came to a fight?" "Most of them," he replied without hesitation. "These are good men who've worked this ranch for years. They won't abandon it to a bunch of self-righteous vigilantes without a fight." "Then we make our stand here," I decided. "Send word to anyone willing to help. If Harold Fairfax wants the Triple T, he'll have to take it over our dead bodies." As Jake rode off to gather whatever allies we could find, Evangeline and I stood on the porch of the house where she'd lived as Marcus's wife, preparing to defend our right to love each other and our right to the land that had shaped us both. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of fire and blood. In a few hours we'd know whether love and courage were enough to overcome suspicion and hatred, or whether the price of forbidden passion was higher than either of us had imagined. The men came with the darkness, their torches visible long before we could make out their faces. 23 riders by my count, spread out in a line that stretched across the width of our front pasture like a cavalry charge from the war stories my father used to tell. Harold Fairfax rode in the center, his silver hair gleaming in the torchlight. Looking every inch, the righteous patriarch came to cleanse his community of corruption. I stood on the front porch of the house my great-grandfather had built, Winchester rifle in my hands, watching death approach with the slow inevitability of a summer storm. Beside me, Evangeline held a shotgun with the same calm determination she'd shown while bandaging wounded ranch hands. Behind us, Jake Morrison and 8 of our most loyal workers waited in the shadows, armed and ready to die for the Triple T if necessary. "Clayton Thornfield," Fairfax called out when the riders were close enough for conversation. "We've come to discuss your situation." "Nothing to discuss, Harold," I replied, my voice carrying across the yard with more confidence than I felt. "This is my land, my home, and my business. You have no authority here." "We have the authority of decent people protecting their community," Fairfax shot back. "You've brought shame on this county with your criminal associations and immoral behavior. We're offering you one last chance to leave peacefully." I could see other familiar faces in the torchlight, ranchers I'd known since childhood, men who'd shared drinks with my father and attended Marcus's funeral. The sight of them riding against me hurt worse than any physical wound, a betrayal that cut deeper than I'd thought possible. And if we refuse? Evangeline stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance that would have made her mother proud. "Then we'll burn you out," Fairfax said coldly, "starting with the barn and working our way up to the house. Either way, you'll be gone by morning." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and I could feel the tension radiating from the men behind me. They were good workers, loyal to the ranch and to my family, but they hadn't signed up to die for crimes they didn't understand in a fight they couldn't win. "You're making a mistake." "Harold," I said, though I kept my rifle pointed at the ground for now, "we've done nothing wrong except fall in love after my brother's death." "Since when is that a crime?" "Since you murdered him to get his wife and his ranch," Fairfax replied. "Don't play innocent with us, boy. Half the county knows you were sniffing around Marcus's woman while he was still alive." The accusation sparked murmurs from the other riders, men who'd heard the gossip but might not have fully believed it until this moment. I could see doubt flickering in some faces, uncertainty about whether they were doing the right thing or simply participating in mob justice. "Marcus died from a rattlesnake bite," Evangeline said, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. "There were witnesses. There was a coroner's examination. If you have evidence of murder, present it to the proper authorities, instead of hiding behind torches and threats." "Evidence?" Fairfax laughed harshly. "What about the federal investigation? What about the criminal connections they uncovered? What about the convenient timing of everything that's happened?" Before I could respond, the sound of approaching horses made everyone turn toward the road. New riders were coming, but these carried badges that reflected the torchlight, and their weapons remained holstered despite the obvious tension. Marshal Davis rode into the circle of light with 3 other federal officers, his face grim but his voice calm as he addressed the crowd. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to disperse. This is now a federal matter. Federal matter or not," Fairfax said stubbornly, "we have a right to protect our community from criminals and murderers." "Actually, you don't," Davis replied. "Vigilante justice is illegal under federal law, especially when it interferes with an ongoing investigation. I'm ordering all of you to return to your homes immediately." The marshal's arrival had changed the dynamics completely, but I wasn't sure if the change favored us or made things worse. Federal involvement might protect us from the immediate threat of mob violence, but it also meant we'd be facing formal charges rather than frontier justice. "Are you arresting them?" one of the riders called out. Davis dismounted and walked toward the porch, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornfield, I need you both to come with me. There have been developments in our investigation that require your immediate attention." "What kind of developments?" I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. "The kind that changes everything," Davis said cryptically. "We found Billy Craddock's camp, along with evidence that's going to interest you both considerably." The marshal's words sent a chill down my spine. If they'd found evidence linking us to the rustlers or to Marcus's death, this conversation might be the last one Evangeline and I ever had as free people. But Davis's next words turned everything I thought I knew upside down. "We found correspondence between Craddock and your brother, Mr. Thornfield, letters that paint a very different picture of what was happening here." The crowd of vigilantes had gone silent, straining to hear details that might justify their presence or expose them as participants in a misguided persecution. Even Fairfax seemed suddenly uncertain, his righteous anger wavering in the face of official revelations. "What kind of correspondence?" Evangeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Davis pulled a leather portfolio from his coat and extracted several folded papers. Letters from Marcus to Craddock, detailing the locations and movements of various cattle herds throughout the county. Information that would have been invaluable to anyone planning systematic rustling operations. The words hit me like physical blows. Despite my earlier fears about the federal investigation, I'd never really believed Marcus could be involved with criminals. Now I was being confronted with documentary evidence that my brother had been betraying his neighbors and his principals for money. "That's impossible," I said. But my voice lacked conviction. "I'm afraid it's not," Davis continued relentlessly. "Your brother was in serious financial trouble, deeper than anyone realized. The ranch was mortgaged beyond its capacity to repay, and several major creditors were threatening foreclosure. Marcus was desperate enough to make a deal with criminals to save the family property." The revelation explained so much that hadn't made sense before. Marcus's secretive trips to town, his evasiveness about ranch finances, his determination to handle the rustling problem personally. He hadn't been trying to catch the thieves. He'd been trying to control the damage when their arrangement went wrong. "But that doesn't make us murderers," Evangeline said, though her voice shook with the shock of learning that her husband had been living a double life. "No, it doesn't," Davis agreed. "In fact, it suggests exactly the opposite. According to Craddock's notes, Marcus was planning to end their arrangement and expose the entire operation to federal authorities. He'd apparently grown tired of compromising his principles and decided to come clean regardless of the consequences. The Marshall's words painted a picture of Marcus that was both worse and better than I'd imagined. Yes, he'd been involved with criminals, but he'd also been trying to make things right before his death. It was exactly the kind of gesture he would make. Dramatic, potentially disastrous, but fundamentally honorable. "The rustlers killed him," I said, understanding that it was flooding through me like cold water. "They couldn't let him expose their operation." "That's our working theory," Davis confirmed. "The rattlesnake bite was real, but the circumstances that led to it were probably arranged. Someone who knew the territory could have herded Marcus toward a den, or simply left him in a place where encountering a snake was inevitable." The crowd of vigilantes had begun to disperse, their moral certainty undermined by revelations that transformed us from suspected murderers into victims of the same criminal conspiracy that had killed Marcus. Harold Fairfax sat his horse in stubborn silence, unwilling to admit error but unable to maintain his accusations in the face of federal evidence. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we clean up the mess your brother's death left behind," Davis said. "The rustling operation is finished, but there are still members of the gang unaccounted for. We'll need your cooperation in identifying anyone who might have had contact with Craddock or his associates." The formal investigation continued for 3 more weeks, during which federal agents scoured the county for evidence and witnesses related to the criminal conspiracy. The Triple T became the center of attention, but now it was the sympathy of neighbors rather than their suspicion. The same people who'd been ready to burn us out were now bringing casseroles and offering help with ranch work. Marcus's reputation was more complicated to restore. The truth about his involvement with the rustlers couldn't be hidden, but the revelation that he'd died trying to make things right softened public judgment considerably. He was remembered as a man who'd made serious mistakes, but had been trying to correct them when he was murdered for his principles. The financial problems that had driven Marcus to criminal association turned out to be less severe than the rustlers had led him to believe. With federal assistance in recovering stolen cattle and insurance settlements for losses, the Triple T's debts were manageable rather than catastrophic. The ranch would survive and eventually prosper under proper management. But the most significant change was in how Evangeline and I were perceived by the community. The revelation that we'd been victims rather than conspirators, combined with the obvious depth of our feelings for each other, transformed us from objects of suspicion into symbols of love, triumphing over tragedy. The proposal happened on a Sunday evening in October, 6 months after Marcus's death and 3 months after the truth about his murder had been revealed. Evangeline and I were sitting on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson, when I finally found the courage to voice what we'd both been thinking for weeks. "Marry me," I said simply, taking her hand in mine. She turned to look at me, her blue eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Are you sure? People will still talk, no matter what the federal marshals found. Some folks will always believe we're guilty of something." "Let them talk," I replied, echoing the words she'd spoken months earlier. "I've wasted too many years caring what other people think. I love you, Evangeline, and I want to spend whatever time I have left making you happy." Her answer was a kiss that tasted of redemption and new beginnings, of love that had survived suspicion and betrayal and emerged stronger for the testing. When we broke apart, both of us were crying, but they were tears of joy rather than grief. The wedding took place the following spring in the same church where she'd married Marcus 4 years earlier. This time, the sanctuary was filled with genuine well-wishers rather than social obligation. People who'd come to celebrate love rather than witness a convenient arrangement. Carolyn came from Austin to serve as matron of honor, bringing news that she'd married a doctor and was expecting her first child. Jake Morrison walked me down the aisle in place of the father and brother I'd lost, his weathered face beaming with pride and satisfaction. Evangeline wore white again, but this time the dress was simpler, more elegant, chosen for beauty rather than display. When she spoke her vows, promising to love and honor and cherish, her voice was strong and certain, nothing like the nervous whispers of her first wedding. The reception was held on the ranch, with tables set up in the garden she'd expanded and improved during her years as a widow. Our guests danced to fiddle music under strings of lanterns while children played among the rose bushes, and their parents shared stories about love and loss and the courage required to start over. Harold Fairfax came, along with his daughter Lucinda, who'd married a banker from San Antonio and seemed genuinely happy with her choice. His presence was an acknowledgement of error, an apology for the night he'd led armed men to our door, and a recognition that the community was stronger when its members supported each other rather than tearing each other down. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Evangeline and I stood in the garden where we'd first acknowledged our love for each other, surrounded by the roses that had bloomed through drought and scandal and grief. The house behind us was the same one where she'd lived as Marcus's wife, but it felt entirely different now, transformed by honesty and hope into something new. "No regrets?" I asked, taking her in my arms as the first stars appeared overhead. "None," she replied firmly. "We've paid for our happiness with enough pain to last several lifetimes. From now on, I intend to enjoy every moment we have together." The years that followed proved her right. The Triple T prospered under our joint management, becoming one of the most successful ranches in the county. We raised cattle and children with equal dedication, building a legacy that honored the past while embracing the future. The scandal that had nearly destroyed us became a distant memory, replaced by the reality of lives well lived and love well earned. Marcus's grave on the hill overlooking the ranch was tended with respect and gratitude for the brother and husband who'd made mistakes but had died trying to correct them. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, Evangeline and I would sit on the porch where we'd first admitted our feelings for each other. We'd hold hands and watch the stars emerge over the land our love had nearly cost us, grateful for the courage that had carried us through darkness into light. The Triple T Ranch remained in the Thornfield family for another 3 generations, a testament to the power of love to overcome suspicion, of truth to triumph over lies, and of redemption to heal even the deepest wounds. The story of Clayton and Evangeline became part of local legend, told and retold as an example of how sometimes the greatest love stories are born from the greatest tragedies. In the end, we learned that forbidden love becomes sacred when it's willing to face any consequence, endure any trial, and sacrifice anything except itself. Our passion had indeed torn a family apart, but it had also built something new and stronger from the pieces, proving that sometimes destruction is necessary for creation. And sometimes the greatest sin is refusing to love when love is offered freely and without reservation. 25 years later, I stood in the same spot where I'd buried my brother Marcus, watching my grandson place wildflowers on a weathered headstone that bore the inscription, "Beloved Brother and Father." The boy was 8 years old, with Evangeline's blue eyes and the Thornfield stubborn streak that had shaped 4 generations of our family. He didn't understand the complicated history that had brought him to this hillside cemetery, but he understood love and loss in the simple way children do. "Tell me again about Uncle Marcus," young Thomas said, settling beside me on the stone bench I'd built years ago for quiet contemplation. The view from this spot encompassed the entire Triple T ranch, rolling pastures where premium cattle grazed, the modernized barn that housed the latest equipment, and the expanded main house where Evangeline and I had raised our 3 children. I smiled at the question I'd answered countless times over the years. Each telling had grown richer with perspective, more nuanced with understanding, more generous with forgiveness. The story of Marcus Thornfield had evolved from tragedy to cautionary tale, to something approaching redemption. "Your Uncle Marcus was a complicated man," I began, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. "He loved this ranch more than anything, but sometimes love can make us do things we shouldn't. He made mistakes that hurt people, including himself, but in the end he tried to make them right." Thomas nodded solemnly, though I suspected he was more interested in the dramatic parts of the story than the moral lessons. At his age, I'd been the same way, preferring tales of gunfights and cattle rustlers to discussions about integrity and redemption. Did he really work with the bad men? For a while, yes. He thought he was protecting the ranch, but he was really putting everyone in danger. Sometimes, when we're scared or desperate, we convince ourselves that wrong choices are right ones. I ruffled his dark hair, so like his father's at that age. The important thing is that he realized his mistake and tried to fix it, even though it cost him his life. And that's when you married Grandmama. The question always made me smile, the way children could reduce complex adult emotions to simple cause and effect. Eventually, we had to wait a proper time after Uncle Marcus died, and we had to make sure people understood that we loved each other for the right reasons. What I didn't tell him was how difficult those early years of marriage had been, despite our deep love for each other. The shadow of scandal had followed us for years. Whispered conversations that stopped when we entered a room. Speculation about whether we'd been lovers while Marcus was alive. Whether we'd somehow hastened his death through our desires, even after the federal investigation cleared us of any wrongdoing. Some people preferred the dramatic version, where forbidden passion led to murder and betrayal. Truth, as I'd learned, was often less satisfying than fiction for those who enjoyed moral outrage, but time and success had gradually worn away the suspicions. The Triple T prospered under our joint management, becoming one of the largest and most profitable ranches in Texas. Evangeline proved herself a formidable businesswoman, handling the financial aspects of the operation with the same intelligence she'd once applied to teaching school. Together, we modernized cattle breeding techniques, expanded into new markets, and weathered droughts and economic downturns that destroyed lesser operations. More importantly, we raised our children with love and honesty, never hiding the complicated circumstances that had brought us together, but always emphasizing that love had triumphed over tragedy. Our eldest son, Marcus, named for his uncle, grew up to be a lawyer who specialized in defending the wrongly accused. And daughter Caroline became a doctor who served the poor communities that larger practices ignored. Our youngest, James, inherited the ranch and the family's gift for reading cattle and weather and the human heart. "Grandpapa Clayton," Thomas said, using the formal title his mother insisted upon, "why are you crying?" I touched my cheek, surprised to find tears I hadn't realized were falling. At 63, I was old enough to understand that time was a thief that stole everything eventually. Youth, strength, the people we loved, the certainty that tomorrow would be like today. Sometimes old men cry when they remember things that made them happy, I said truthfully. Your grandmother and I have had a good life together, better than either of us expected when we were young. Is Grandmama sick again? The question hit me like a physical blow, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. Evangeline had been fighting consumption for 6 months, the same disease that had killed my father 20 years earlier. The doctors in Austin said there was nothing to be done except make her comfortable and hope for the best, but we both knew what the best likely meant. She's resting, I said carefully. The medicine makes her very tired. Thomas accepted this explanation with the resilience of children who adapt to adult realities they can't change. He picked up his flowers, Indian, paintbrush and bluebonnets he'd gathered from the meadow, behind the house, and placed them carefully on Marcus's grave. I wish I could have met him, he said seriously. He would have loved you. I replied and meant it. Despite everything that had happened, despite the pain and betrayal and nearly losing the ranch because of his choices, Marcus had been a man who loved children and would have been a devoted uncle to the next generation. We walked back to the house together, the boy chattering about his plans for the summer and his hopes to learn cattle roping from his father. The normalcy of his concerns, ordinary boyhood ambitions unmarked by scandal or tragedy, was perhaps the greatest victory Evangeline and I had achieved. Our children and grandchildren lived in a world where love was celebrated rather than condemned, where family stories were sources of pride rather than shame. The house we approached was larger than the one Evangeline had shared with Marcus, expanded over the years to accommodate growing families and changing needs. The original structure remained at its heart, but wings had been added for children's rooms, a modern kitchen, and a library that held Evangeline's growing collection of books on everything from cattle breeding to women's suffrage. I found her in that library, resting in the chair by the window that overlooked her expanded garden. At 58, she was still beautiful, though illness had sharpened her features and given her skin a translucent quality that reminded me uncomfortably of her mother in those final days. "How was your visit with Marcus?" she asked, looking up from the letter she'd been reading. Her voice was weaker than it had been even a week ago, but her eyes remained bright with intelligence and humor. Peaceful. Thomas left flowers. I settled into the chair beside her, close enough to take her hand. "Letter from Caroline?" "From the suffrage committee in Austin. They want me to speak at their next meeting about women's roles in ranch management." She smiled at my expression. "Don't worry. I told them I'm not well enough to travel, but I've written them a letter they can read instead." Evangeline's involvement in the women's suffrage movement had been one of the surprises of our marriage. The shy schoolteacher who'd married Marcus had evolved into a formidable advocate for women's rights, using her success at the Triple T as evidence that women could manage businesses and make financial decisions as well as any man. Her speeches and writings had made her something of a celebrity in progressive circles, a real-life example of female capability that was harder to dismiss than theoretical arguments. She'd testified before the state legislature, corresponded with national suffrage leaders, and mentored young women who wanted to break into traditionally male professions. The committee thinks Texas might be one of the first states to grant women the vote, she continued. It would be fitting, don't you think? This state has always been more concerned with what people can do than what they're supposed to do. I squeezed her hand gently. You've done more to change minds about women's capabilities than a dozen politicians. We've done it together, she corrected. None of my success would have been possible without a husband who valued my opinions and trusted my judgment. It was true, though it had taken me years to fully understand the revolutionary nature of our partnership. In a world where most wives were expected to be ornamental and obedient, Evangeline and I had built a relationship based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. She handled finances while I managed livestock. She dealt with suppliers while I supervised ranch hands. She entertained business associates while I negotiated cattle sales. The arrangement had shocked some people and inspired others. particularly women who saw in our marriage proof that love and equality could coexist. We'd received letters from all over the country, from couples trying to build similar partnerships, and from single women who drew courage from Evangeline's example. Thomas asked about Marcus again, I said, changing the subject to something less emotionally charged. He's trying to understand how someone can be both good and bad. Children always want simple answers to complicated questions. Evangeline closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, fatigue washing over her like a tide. Maybe that's what we should have learned from all this, that people are more complex than we want them to be, that love and betrayal can exist in the same heart. She was right, as she usually was about such things. The years had taught me that Marcus wasn't a villain who'd betrayed his family for money, nor was he a hero who died trying to right his wrongs. He was simply a man who'd made difficult choices under pressure, some of them good and some of them terrible, all of them human. I've been thinking about the letters, Evangeline said quietly. The ones we found in Marcus's desk after the federal investigation ended. I knew which letters she meant. Hidden in a secret compartment we'd discovered while settling the estate were personal notes Marcus had written but never sent. Apologies to neighbors whose cattle had been stolen, confessions of his involvement with the rustlers, explanations of the financial pressures that had driven him to crime. Most painful of all had been a letter addressed to Evangeline, asking for forgiveness and understanding, acknowledging that he'd been a poor husband who'd taken her love for granted. In it, he'd admitted knowing about her feelings for me, expressed regret for the impossible position his choices had put us both in, and given what amounted to a blessing for our eventual union. He knew, Evangeline continued, her voice barely above a whisper, about us, about how we felt. He knew, and he was trying to find a way to make things right for everyone. Maybe that's his real legacy, I said. Not the mistakes he made, but the love he had for both of us, even when it must have hurt to see what he was losing. We sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon sun slanted through the library windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories in the golden light. Outside, I could hear the sounds of ranch life continuing, cattle lowing in the distance, ranch hands calling to each other as they finished the day's work. The dinner bell ringing from the kitchen, where our cook was preparing the evening meal. These were the sounds that had shaped my entire life, the rhythm of days and seasons that connected me to the land my great-grandfather had claimed, and my father had defended, and I had nearly lost to scandal and suspicion. The Triple T had survived drought and economic collapse, rustlers and federal investigations, family tragedy and community outrage. It would survive me too, passing to my son and his children and their children after them. Clayton, Evangeline said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been all day. I want you to promise me something, anything. When I'm gone, don't let grief turn you into a hermit. Find someone to share your remaining years with, someone who can appreciate the man you've become. She opened her eyes and looked at me with fierce intensity. I've had the love of 2 good men in my lifetime, which is more than most women can say. I don't want you to spend yours alone just because you think loyalty demands it. The thought of loving anyone else seemed impossible, like trying to imagine breathing different air or seeing with different eyes. Evangeline had been the center of my world for so long that I couldn't conceive of existing without her. I'm not ready for that conversation, I said honestly. You never will be ready, she replied with a tired smile. That's why I'm bringing it up now, while I can still make you promise. All right, I said, though the words felt like betrayal even as I spoke them. If the time comes, I'll try to keep my heart open. Good. She closed her eyes again, satisfied. Now tell me what young James said about the cattle prices at market this week. I want to make sure we're getting fair value for our stock. And so we spent the remainder of the afternoon discussing business, as we had for 25 years of marriage. Evangeline's mind remained sharp, even as her body weakened, her insights into market trends and breeding programs as valuable as they'd ever been. It was a conversation that could have taken place in any of our years together, familiar and comfortable and utterly normal. That evening, after Thomas had been put to bed and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, I found myself standing on the front porch, where Evangeline and I had first acknowledged our love for each other. The scene looked much the same as it had 26 years ago. Though electric lights now illuminated the yard where oil lamps had once flickered, Evangeline joined me there, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill, moving slowly but under her own power. We stood together looking out over the land that had been our battlefield and our prize, our burden and our blessing. "No regrets?" I asked, echoing the question I'd posed on our wedding night. "Only one," she said, surprising me. "I regret that we wasted so many years pretending we didn't love each other. Think how much more time we could have had together if we'd been braver sooner. We had the time we were meant to have," I said, putting my arm around her waist. "Quality matters more than quantity." "Spoken like a true cattleman," she teased, leaning against me with the trust of long marriage. "Always evaluating the value of the stock." We watched the stars emerge over the hills that had witnessed our entire love story, from the first stolen glances to this quiet moment of approaching farewell. Somewhere in those hills was the spot where Marcus had died, where federal marshals had uncovered the truth that set us free, where a rattlesnake's bite had changed the course of 3 lives forever. Evangeline died peacefully 3 weeks later, in her sleep, on a morning when spring rain was washing the winter dust from her beloved garden. I held her hand as her breathing grew shallow and finally stopped, grateful that pain had left her before consciousness did, that her last words had been expressions of love rather than regret. The funeral filled the church beyond capacity, with mourners who came not just to honor the woman who'd been my wife, but to celebrate the life of someone who'd fought for causes larger than herself. Suffrage leaders came from across the state, ranch wives who'd found courage in her example, young women who'd benefited from scholarships she'd established for female education, but perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from Harold Fairfax, now an old man who'd outlived his certainties about right and wrong. He approached me after the service, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Clayton," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you an apology that's 25 years overdue. I was wrong about you and Evangeline, wrong about everything. She was one of the finest women this county ever produced, and you were lucky to have her. We were lucky to have each other," I corrected, shaking his offered hand. "And lucky to live long enough to prove that love can overcome almost anything." The years that followed were quieter, but not empty. I kept my promise to Evangeline, eventually finding companionship with Sarah Mitchell, a widow whose husband had died in a railroad accident. She was a gentle woman who understood that she was sharing my life rather than replacing its previous occupant. Content to build new memories while honoring old ones, I lived to see women gain the right to vote, to watch my grandchildren grow up in a world where their grandmother's achievements were celebrated rather than scandalous. I saw the Triple T transition from a traditional cattle ranch to a diversified agricultural operation that embraced new technologies while maintaining old values. Most importantly, I lived to see the story of Clayton and Evangeline Thornfield transform from local scandal to local legend, told as an example of how love could triumph over adversity when it was willing to face any consequence. Children who grew up on neighboring ranches learned our story as others learned fairy tales. A reminder that sometimes the greatest loves required the greatest courage. When my own time came, I faced it without fear, knowing that I'd lived a life worth living, loved deeply and been loved in return, built something lasting that would survive long after my name was forgotten. The forbidden love that had once threatened to destroy everything had instead become the foundation for a legacy that would endure for generations. As I lay in the same bed where Evangeline had drawn her last breath, surrounded by children and grandchildren whose very existence testified to the power of love over prejudice, I thought about the choices that had brought us to this moment. Every scandal endured, every accusation faced, every moment of courage when it would have been easier to surrender. All of it had been worthwhile for the life we'd built together. The Triple T Ranch still stands today, run by Thornfield descendants who carry forward the values their ancestors fought to establish. Visitors often stop at the family cemetery on the hill, reading the headstones that tell the story of three people whose lives intersected in tragedy and redemption. Marcus Thornfield's grave bears the original inscription, "Beloved husband and son," but time has added to its meaning. He's remembered now not just as a victim of circumstances, but as a man whose final choice, the decision to expose the rustling operation, despite the personal cost, helped his brother and former wife find the happiness that had eluded all three of them while he lived. Clayton and Evangeline rest side by side, their matching headstones bearing the simple inscription, "Together forever," a promise that proved stronger than death itself. Their story has become part of Texas folklore, a reminder that love worth having is love worth fighting for, no matter the obstacles or the odds. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the wind sighs through the oak trees that shade their graves, visitors say they can still feel the presence of that great love, a force that transformed tragedy into triumph and proved that some passions are indeed stronger than fear, more enduring than scandal, and more powerful than death itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.